The scent of lilies, thick and cloyingly sweet, hung in the cold air of the old Boston cathedral, a fragrance I knew I would despise for the rest of my life. The final sorrowful notes of a hymn had just faded into the vaulted ceiling, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. I stood before the mahogany casket, my hand resting on its polished surface, feeling the last faint warmth of my son's existence slipping away from the world. Liam was gone, and in that moment of pure, unadulterated grief, the sharp, arrogant click of stilettos on ancient marble echoed from the back of the nave. It was a sound of profound desecration, a violation of this sacred, terrible space. Every head turned. Framed in the grand arched doorway stood Isabel Sterling, the woman who had been my son's wife and who had abandoned him 15 years ago. She hadn't attended a single one of his birthdays, hadn't answered a single one of his calls during the darkest days of his illness, and had vanished from his life so completely that she had become a ghost, a half-forgotten nightmare. Now the ghost had returned, dressed in a black designer dress that was more appropriate for a cocktail party than a funeral, her face a mask of cold, theatrical sorrow. The whispers began immediately, a rustle of confusion and outrage that spread through the pews like a lit fuse. But Isabel ignored them. She strode down the central aisle, her movements fluid and confident, a predator entering a room of unsuspecting prey. She stopped not at the casket, but beside it, turning to face the stunned mourners as if she were stepping onto a stage. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear, resonant, and utterly devoid of grief. "I am here," she announced, the words slicing through the heavy silence, "to claim what is rightfully mine. As the lawful wife of the deceased, I am the sole heir to the $24 million estate my husband, Liam Vance, has left behind." The air was sucked from the cathedral. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the room. My legs threatened to buckle, but I locked my knees, my gaze fixed on the brass plate on Liam's coffin, his name etched in elegant script. He had not yet begun his final journey into the earth, and this vulture was already picking at the bones of his life's work. It wasn't sadness that filled me then. It was a glacial fury, a cold, clarifying rage that settled deep in my bones. I felt my lawyer, Margaret Shaw, a woman whose quiet demeanor belied a will of iron, take a half-step closer to me. I gave her the slightest shake of my head. Not yet. Isabel's own lawyer, a young man who looked barely out of law school, stood nervously beside her, fumbling with a folder. He began to stammer about marital status and survivors' rights, his voice trembling under the weight of 100 incredulous stares. He clearly hadn't done his homework. He had no idea he was brandishing a losing hand. Across the aisle, I could see the shock morphing into disgust on the faces of Liam's friends and colleagues. They had witnessed his struggle. They knew the truth. But they remained silent, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the display. They looked at me, their eyes filled with pity, expecting me to crumble, to weep, to lash out. I did none of those things. My late husband, a man of profound patience, used to say I was carved from New England granite. That day, I felt it. I slowly, deliberately turned to face her. My 68 years on this earth had taught me that the most powerful response to manufactured drama is absolute stillness. Isabel met my gaze, her eyes cold and triumphant. She had expected a grieving, hysterical mother. She had found a stone wall. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before she masked it with another layer of arrogance. "I am not here to cause a scene," she declared, her voice rising slightly. "I am simply here to ensure my husband's final wishes are respected." It was then that I finally spoke. My voice was low, not a whisper, but a clear, cold statement of fact that carried to every corner of the silent church. "You are not his wife. You haven't been for 15 years. For the first time, she faltered. Her lawyer whispered frantically in her ear, but the damage was done. She had built her entire gambit on the assumption that my grief would make me weak, that I would be too shattered to fight back. She had fundamentally misjudged her opponent. Maggie Shaw stepped forward, moving with the silent grace of a seasoned warrior. She didn't address Isabel. Instead, she handed a crisp, folded document to the presiding priest. He opened it, his eyes scanning the page before they widened in understanding. A finalized divorce decree. Maggie's voice was calm but cut like a surgeon's scalpel. Signed and notarized 15 years ago. It includes a full and irrevocable waiver of any future claims on all assets, current or forthcoming. The truth, stark and undeniable, landed in the center of the room with the force of a physical blow. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabel stood frozen, her face a mottled canvas of shock and fury. She scanned the pews, searching for an ally, a friendly face, anyone who would speak up for her. She found none. I had been there. I had been there for every terrifying diagnosis, every round of debilitating chemotherapy, every surgery that carved away pieces of my son while she was living a new life somewhere on the West Coast. She had left him with a mountain of medical debt and a broken heart. She had vanished until the scent of money, his hard-earned success, was strong enough to lure her back from the dead. Without another glance in her direction, I turned and began my slow walk out of the cathedral, Maggie at my side. Our steps were measured, dignified. As we passed, I heard a friend of Liam's whisper my name, Eleanor, with a sound of profound respect. Another muttered, "Justice." But this wasn't justice. Not yet. This was merely the opening salvo in a war she had foolishly declared on sacred ground. And I knew with every fiber of my being that what was to come would make this public humiliation look like a moment of gentle mercy. The murmurs in the cathedral swelled behind us as we stepped out into the crisp Boston air. Veronica's voice, now stripped of its confidence and sharp with indignation, was a shrill, fading echo. We didn't look back. The funeral director, his face pale and beaded with sweat, rushed to apologize for the disruption. I waved him off with a quiet word. Grief does not always bring out the best in people. In the back of the town car, I sat in silence, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my breathing slow and controlled. It was the practiced calm of someone who had spent years in hospital waiting rooms, mastering the art of containing a storm within. It took us 12 minutes to reach the imposing granite building that housed Maggie's law firm. Her assistant escorted us directly to a soundproof conference room overlooking the city. Maggie placed 2 thick binders on the polished mahogany table. The first contained Liam's updated last will and testament, signed 9 months prior. I had been there, holding his hand, its grip surprisingly firm despite his illness. He left everything to me, the company he had built from the ground up, the portfolio of stocks, the house on Cape Cod, and the intellectual property rights to an innovative app he'd developed in his final year. Isabel Sterling was not mentioned. It was as if she had been surgically excised from the record of his life. The second binder held the divorce settlement. Maggie had already tabbed the relevant page, the full waiver, signed in Isabel's own flamboyant script. "She has no legal standing, Eleanor," Maggie said, her voice a low, steady anchor. "But her willingness to stage that scene at the funeral tells me she isn't rational. She's desperate, and a desperate person is dangerous. Expect her to escalate." I nodded, my jaw tight. This was no longer just about money. It was about memory. It was about honor. I would not allow the woman who had abandoned my son in his darkest hour to desecrate the final chapter of his life. Maggie then slid a thinner folder across the table. "There's something else," she said. Liam recorded a private video message. It's stored digitally under attorney-client privilege. A jolt went through me. I hadn't known. Liam, always thinking, always preparing. Our next stop was the courthouse. Maggie had arranged an emergency meeting with a probate judge, a courtesy afforded due to the size of the estate and the clear potential for a contentious dispute. The judge, a stern-faced woman with shrewd eyes, reviewed the will and the divorce decree. Within an hour, she had issued a temporary protective order over all of Liam's assets, effectively freezing everything until the will could be formally executed. It was a preemptive strike, a legal wall built before the first arrow could be fired. As we descended the courthouse steps, Maggie's phone rang. It was Isabel's young, out-of-his-depth lawyer. Maggie put him on speaker. His voice was reedy and uncertain as he requested a meeting to discuss an amicable resolution. "All future communication will be in writing," Maggie stated, her tone glacial. "And be advised that Ms. Sterling's intentional infliction of emotional distress at a religious service will be duly noted in all forthcoming correspondence." The call ended abruptly. I had spent so much of my life being the peacemaker, smoothing over conflicts for the sake of a quiet life. That part of me had died with Liam. That evening, in the quiet of my study, I opened the file containing Liam's video. His face appeared on my screen thinner than I remembered, the shadows under his eyes telling a story of pain and sleepless nights. But his voice was strong, his gaze direct. He spoke of his vision for the foundation he wanted me to establish, a foundation to fund scholarships for underprivileged students in technology and to support families navigating long-term illnesses. He spoke of our life together after Isabel left, of the quiet strength I had shown him. Then his expression hardened slightly. "If she comes back," he said, his voice dropping, "and I suspect she will, I need you to stand your ground, Mom. Not for the money, for the truth. She chose to walk away from me. But you never left. You were there for every needle, every scan, every moment of fear. You chose me. I am choosing you now. You deserve every good thing I can still give you." I played that part again, and then a third time, the words a balm and a mandate. The grief was still a raw, open wound, but now it was fortified by purpose. I opened a notebook and wrote down 3 names: Anika Sharma, Liam's fiercely loyal CFO, Julian Costa, the lawyer who had handled his divorce, and Marcus Thorne, the ICU nurse who had been with him in his final weeks. They were not just witnesses, they were keepers of his truth. Isabel thought this was a battle over an estate. She was wrong. This was a battle over a life story, and I would not allow her to publish a single fraudulent word. The war had begun at the funeral, but it would be won in the details, in the archives, in the undeniable record of a life she had chosen to forfeit. The following morning, the whispers from the cathedral had found their way onto the internet. My phone began to chime with calls and texts from old friends and distant relatives, all offering condolences, laced with a palpable, morbid curiosity. They weren't sure what to believe, and in the absence of a clear narrative, they were reserving judgment. I didn't respond. I sat in my kitchen, a mug of black coffee warming my hands, and watched the sunrise paint the Boston sky. The quiet was shattered around 10 a.m. Isabel had made her next move. She posted a carefully cropped, artfully filtered photograph of her and Liam from their wedding day. The caption was a masterpiece of manipulative sentimentality. "Heartbroken to say a final farewell to the great love of my life. My only wish is that his true legacy is honored. Justice for Liam." The comments flooded in, a torrent of sympathy from strangers who saw only the image of a grieving widow. Words like brave, strong, and tragic appeared alongside heart emojis. A few commenters, likely plants, immediately began speculating about a greedy family trying to cut a wife out of her rightful inheritance. Isabel was not just fighting a legal battle. She was waging a campaign for public opinion, and she was dangerously good at it. I immediately forwarded a screenshot to Maggie. Her reply was instantaneous. monitoring, stay the course. Anika Sharma, Liam's CFO, called a few minutes later, her voice tight with anger. "Journalists are calling," she said. "They're asking about the widow. They're asking for a comment on her claims." "Say nothing," I told her. "We are not going to react. We are going to respond." I met Maggie at the Boston Athenaeum, a private library with thick, soundproof walls. We needed a secure space to plan. Our strategy would have 3 fronts. First, the legal front. We would file a motion to have the will validated and to permanently bar Isabel from interfering with the estate. That was already in progress. Second, the evidentiary front. We would gather sworn affidavits from everyone in Liam's inner circle. Anika had 15 years of emails and financial records. Julian had every document related to the divorce. And Marcus, the nurse, had kept a detailed log of Liam's final days, including a note that Liam had refused to allow Isabel's name to even be mentioned in his presence. The third front was the one that mattered most, the public front. "The best defense isn't a legal brief," Maggie said, her eyes glinting. "It's a better story, and we have the true one." We would host a public dedication ceremony to officially launch the foundation Liam had envisioned. It would not be a press conference or a rebuttal. It would be a celebration of his life's work, a powerful, visible demonstration of his true intentions. The mayor had been a supporter of Liam's philanthropic plans for months. We had the correspondence to prove it. We would continue the work Liam had started, making Isabel's narrative of a grieving, excluded widow look not just false, but absurd. That evening, Anika met me at Liam's now empty office. The space was cold and silent, a ghost of the vibrant energy it once held. His favorite mug still sat on the corner of his desk. Faded equations and code snippets were still visible on the whiteboard, a testament to a mind that had worked brilliantly until the very end. Anika handed me a small, encrypted flash drive. "His personal emails," she said softly. "The last 3 months. I've filtered out the noise. What's left is what matters." Back in my study, I opened the drive. There were dozens of emails, but 3 were flagged with red stars. One was to Maggie, outlining his final instructions for the will. One was to Anika, detailing the financial framework for the foundation. The third was to me. It had never been sent. It was saved as a draft. I clicked it open, my heart pounding. "Mom," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. It also means she's probably shown up. I'm sorry you have to deal with this. I'm sorry for the fight she is going to bring to your door. But I need you to remember this. You are the only one who stayed. You were my advocate when I couldn't speak, my hands when I couldn't hold a pen, my memory when the fog rolled in. You sat in the dark with me. You never once looked away. Don't let her rewrite the history that you and I lived through, page by painful, beautiful page. I chose you, never her. Your love was the only inheritance that ever truly mattered." The last of my hesitation dissolved. The quiet, simmering fury in my chest crystallized into a diamond-hard resolve. Isabel wanted to weaponize public perception with a handful of lies and an old photograph. I would meet her on that battlefield armed with 15 years of truth. In 3 days, at the public launch of his foundation, Liam's story would be told in his own words, and her lies would be burned to ash in the light of it. 3 days later, I walked into Boston City Hall's main auditorium. The room was already buzzing with a curated audience of tech executives, community leaders, academics, and a handful of trusted journalists. A large banner bearing the foundation's name, the Liam Vance Legacy Initiative, hung above the stage. Liam's face, captured in a candid moment of quiet, confident thought, smiled out from the event programs. Maggie and Anika managed the check-in, their expressions professional and unreadable. Julian stood by a side table, his legal binders arranged like fortifications. Marcus, the ICU nurse, was there in his civilian clothes, a quiet, reassuring presence. At precisely 10 a.m., the doors were closed. Maggie stepped to the podium. "Good morning," she began, her voice resonating with authority. "We are here today not to mourn a loss, but to launch a legacy. What you are about to witness is a story of intention, clarity, and undeniable truth." The lights dimmed. The large screen behind her flickered to life. It was the video from Liam's private files. He sat in his favorite armchair, looking directly into the camera. His voice, though weakened by his illness, was steady and clear. "If you are watching this," he said, "it means my time is up. I wanted to explain in my own words the choices I have made regarding my estate. There should be no confusion. There should be no debate. The truth should be allowed to speak for itself." He went on to describe, with calm precision, his reasons for leaving his entire estate to me, for the sole purpose of funding the foundation. "My mother was my partner in this life," he stated. "My former wife, Isabel, chose to leave that partnership long ago. When I needed her most, she was absent. When I built something of value, she returned. I cannot and will not allow that opportunism to define the end of my story. My legacy belongs to the person who never left my side." When the video ended, the room was utterly still. I rose and walked to the podium. I spoke not of grief, but of purpose. I announced the Foundation's first round of scholarships. I detailed the grants being issued to local schools for STEM programs. I outlined the emergency relief fund for families facing catastrophic medical debt. Then, I looked out at the assembled faces and addressed the elephant in the room. "Some of you," I said, my voice even, "may have seen speculation online. I will not engage with gossip. I will respond only with evidence." The screen lit up again. This time, it displayed a timeline of verified documents. Liam's emails to Maggie, clearly stating his intentions. At the scanned, highlighted divorce decree, with Isabel's signature on the waiver of rights. And then, the final devastating slide, a screenshot of an email Isabel had sent to a friend just weeks before the funeral, an email that had been anonymously forwarded to Maggie's office. It read, "I don't care what it takes. I'm going back to Boston to get what he owed me. If his mother thinks she can stand in my way, she's in for the fight of her life." That was her story, I said into the silence. This foundation is his. A ripple of applause started, then grew into a standing ovation. I didn't smile. I simply nodded once and returned to my seat. I had seen Isabel slip in late and take a seat in the very back row. When the lights came up, she was gone. She had fled without a sound, but her defeat was the loudest thing in the room. As the event concluded, people surrounded me, not with pity, but with respect. They shared stories of Liam's kindness, his quiet generosity. That afternoon, a photograph from the event appeared in the Boston Globe's online edition. It showed me at the podium, with the image of my son projected on the screen beside me. The caption read, "A mother's stand. Eleanor Vance secures her son's legacy." And that was the truth. It wasn't revenge. It was a restoration. The next morning, the silence was deafening. No frantic calls, no new social media posts. But it was the tense quiet of a battlefield between skirmishes. At 8:30 a.m., Maggie sent a 3-word text. "Check your email." Isabel had retaliated. She had released a heavily edited video clip, a Frankenstein's monster of spliced-together audio from old voicemails and video calls. In it, Liam's words were twisted to make him sound regretful and confused about the will. Isabel had added her own tearful voiceover, painting herself as the victim of a manipulative mother who had isolated a sick man. She titled it, "His Real Final Words." It was a vile piece of propaganda, but it was effective. The comments section quickly filled with a toxic mix of support for her and vitriol for me. We met at the library again. Maggie had already had a forensic audio expert analyze the clip. It was a fabrication, but a clever one. Our response had to be swift and overwhelming. We released the full, unedited source videos and audio files from which Isabel had stolen her clips. The originals, time-stamped and unedited, showed Liam speaking lucidly and forcefully about his decisions. Next, we released what Maggie called the behavioral pattern documentation, a curated collection of emails from Liam's business partners and friends detailing Isabel's previous attempts to get money from him over the years, all of which he had rebuffed. We held a small press briefing, distributing the evidence in neat printed packets. We didn't offer sound bites. We offered facts. The narrative began to shift. Several news blogs that had initially run with Isabel's story issued retractions. Her manipulated video was flagged and taken down from 2 platforms for violating community standards. But she wasn't done. Late that night, Maggie called. "She's filed a formal motion to contest the will," she said, claiming undue influence and lack of capacity. It was the move we had been expecting. It would force a legal battle, trigger discovery, and drag us into a war of attrition. "Let her," I said, a strange sense of calm settling over me. "I'm not afraid of the records. The deeper she digs, the more of her own lies she will unearth." Reading the official motion was like being physically assaulted. The pages were filled with legal jargon that accused me of the basest of betrayals, that I had used my son's illness to poison his mind against Isabel, that I had coerced him, that I was a ruthless manipulator. I sat at my kitchen table, the accusations blurring before my eyes, and I let the grief wash over me. For a moment it was all-consuming. They called me ruthless, but they hadn't been there the night Liam woke up screaming, convinced he was a child again. They hadn't held him as he wept with a pain so profound that morphine couldn't touch it. They hadn't been there when he looked at me, his eyes clear and lucid, and made me promise me, Mom, that she would never profit from his death. The next morning, I met with Maggie. "Let's make it final," I told her. We prepared our response, a mountain of evidence. Daniel the nurse's sworn affidavit about Liam's mental clarity in his final weeks. Annika's detailed financial records showing Isabel had been removed as a beneficiary years ago, Julian's testimony about the divorce. But I also wrote a letter, not for the court, but for the Foundation's public record. "I am not my son's voice," I wrote, "but I am the echo of what he believed. He believed in truth that did not need to shout to be heard. I did not stay by his side for a reward. I stayed because I loved him." While we waited for the court's decision, Isabel went on a media tour, crying on camera and painting herself as a wronged woman. But the public was warier now. Our evidence had cast a long shadow of doubt over her story. The judge's ruling arrived on a Wednesday, not with a bang, but in a quiet email. The motion was dismissed in its entirety. The judge's written opinion was a thorough condemnation of Isabel's claims, which he described as unfounded, speculative, and in several instances, intentionally misleading. That last phrase was key. It opened the door for consequences, and they came swiftly. The court scheduled a sanctions hearing to review Isabel's and her lawyer's abuse of the legal process. They had submitted altered evidence. They had lied. Faced with public humiliation and potential disbarment for her lawyer, Isabel requested the hearing be closed. The judge denied it. I decided to attend. I sat in the back of the small courtroom and watched as the judge methodically dissected their case, revealing it to be nothing more than a desperate, fraudulent money grab. Sanctions were issued. Isabel was ordered to pay for all of my legal fees, a sum that would be financially crippling. Her lawyer was referred to the state bar for disciplinary action. I saw her after, in the hallway. She looked hollowed out, the arrogant confidence replaced by a brittle, vacant stare. The war was over. She had lost. That evening, I sat in my garden, not in triumph, but in quiet. The foundation was safe. Liam's legacy was secure. A few days later, a handwritten letter arrived. It was from her. A single sentence. I need 5 minutes to say one thing in person. We met in a public greenhouse surrounded by the silent, beautiful life of orchids. She didn't apologize. She said she was angry that she had been written out of her own history, that she had come back not for money, but for relevance. Legacy isn't built on drama, I told her, my voice quiet but firm. It's built on presence, on staying when there is nothing to gain. You are forgotten because you chose to disappear from his pain. It was the last time we ever spoke. Her downfall was quiet but complete. The sanctions bankrupted her. An investigation into her own dubious charitable foundations revealed a pattern of fraud, leading to further legal trouble. She faded from the headlines, a footnote in a story she had tried and failed to hijack. My life, however, began anew. I poured my energy into Liam's foundation. It flourished, becoming a beacon of hope for countless families. I never remarried. My work became my partner, my purpose. I had not just protected my son's legacy, I had become its living embodiment. The true victory was not in the courtroom. It was in the quiet, steady work of turning our shared pain into a public good, ensuring that the name Liam Vance would forever be associated not with a bitter legal battle, but with kindness, innovation, and unwavering love.